John, good afternoon, and if you would, so that people who are watching this will know who you are, tell us who you are and what part of Davie County that you live in.
I'm John Caudle. I live in the garden spot of Davie County of Farmington.
Right in the center of Davie County.
That's right.
And are you a native of Davie County?
Yes, I was actually born in the Farmington area and lived here basically all my life, except the time I was in the service and about 2 years other than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go right into the story of your experience in World War II. How old were you whenever you went into the war? And did you enlist? How did you get into the war?
Well, I graduated in 1943, just out of Farmington High School, and I volunteered for the Air Force at that time. I had to wait until I was 18 before I could be inducted, and January the 31st of 44. On a Friday afternoon, I went home and I had my orders to report to Fort Bragg on Monday morning by myself, and I was one more scared little boy.
And how old were you?
I was just had turned 18.
Wow. So you got those orders. You were living in Farmington, and how did you get to Fort Bragg? A bus?
On a Greyhound bus.
Mm-hmm. And were you on a bus with people that you knew? Was there other people from our community, or were you set out on your own?
I was on my own, and say when I reported into Fort Bragg, it was raining,
Mm-hmm.
and I was by myself and had to start asking questions of where I was supposed to go and what I was to do.
Mm-hmm. So once you got to Fort Bragg, tell us how you went from Fort Bragg to where, and to what theater you found yourself in.
Well, at Fort Bragg, I stayed there. I think it was a total of 3 days. That was just an indoctrination where we joined up with a total group for basic training, and we boarded a train. I guess it's about the fourth day for Miami Beach.
Mm-hmm.
We went through basic training in Miami Beach, stayed in hotels right in downtown along the Biscayne Bay on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach. That was quite an experience, but you had to hit the water every morning at 5 o'clock. Whether you could swim or not, you had to go in the water.
So you went from seeing the banks of the Yadkin River to the beautiful coast of Florida.
Yeah, that was quite an experience. We did our all of our drill, so forth, basic training, exercise, and so forth in the parks
Mm-hmm.
in Miami Beach. I went in enlisted as an aviation cadet and started the program there. We took all the basics, but at that particular time, is the way the government worked, Army worked at that time. It depended on what field they needed men in. And at that particular time, they needed a lot of people in other fields other than pilot training. So I was one of the unlucky ones that got transferred into a gunnery school at Harlingen, Texas, and that's where I went through gunnery school on a B-24. And I finished that after about 6 weeks. Went to Omaha, Nebraska, I believe it was. I've forgotten the name of the field just outside of Omaha, and was transferred to a B-29 squadron. And the first time I saw one of those planes, I said, it'll never get off the ground.
Big plane.
That was a big monster at that particular time.
Mm-hmm.
So,
4 engines?
Oh, yes, for 2,200 horsepower each engine, I think.
Each?
Each.
So you went from there, what was your next journey?
To Wendover, Utah. And we went on to the field. It was completely empty. We had I believe it was the 393rd Squadron 504th Group. We went on to the field, and it was completely empty. And we couldn't figure out what was going on, actually, because we wondered why this squadron was there by ourselves. And after the first day, everybody was called together and said, what you see here, what you hear here, leave it here.
Mm-hmm.
And that really was the beginning of the atomic bomb group training.
Mm-hmm.
And I did go down to see, I believe Tom Farabee was major at that time. I went down to see him one time while I was there.
And you knew him, I'm assuming.
I had heard of him before,
Mm-hmm.
and I just went down to visit him for a short time. And but anyway, as a result of that experience, there was actually 5 gunners on the plane, and this particular group was only going to use one, which would be a so-called central fire control gunner.
Mm-hmm.
He was located amidship up the top, and he could control all guns from that one location.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a tail gunner, so they had no need of me there. So I was shipped out back to Clovis, New Mexico, and then from there on over to the Pacific. Landed on Tinian first, Saipan, and then 2 days later went down to Tinian, where I was based, and flew my missions over Japan out of there.
Mm-hmm. But before we get into the actual missions that you found yourself in, I want you to help the people that are listening understand how you get into that plane, how you get back to the tail gunner position. How does that work?
Well, there was 2 ways to get into the plane. One was through the nose wheel area. That's where the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and navigator went in. The rest of us went in back towards the tail end section. There was a side door where we all went in. Of course, you had to have ladders to get in the plane. There was a tunnel, what we call the tunnel, between the back of the plane and the nose that was about maybe 28 inches in diameter. And I think it was about, I've forgotten now, something like 20 feet in length that you had to crawl through to get from the front to the back.
Kind of like a scuttle hole.
Scuttle hole.
Mm-hmm. So when you would get to the very back, was there a box? Was there?
Well, this when you got to the out to the end of the tunnel, there was an open passageway where the midship side gunners sat. There's one on each side that had a bubble that they sat in, and they'd have full range of view from the tail to the nose of the plane. To go to the tail, you went back to the bulkhead end of the tail, and there was a hole there about with a bulkhead about 2 foot, a little better, 28, maybe 30 inches in diameter. You crawl through, and once you crawl through, then you could squeeze up, and a folding seat would come down behind you. You could stand up pretty well in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And it was close quarters.
Were you ever claustrophobic?
Not really.
Mm-hmm.
I went through when I went through gunnery school. Started out on a B-24, and that it was just like a barrel on the back end of that tail, and that was just like you were sitting out into open space, and that was a little bit scary for the first time or two.
Mm-hmm.
You got used to it.
So let me repeat what you said earlier. You left Salt Lake City, I believe you said?
Well, Wendover, Utah.
Wendover, Utah, and then you flew to Saipan, or?
Well, I went from there to Clovis, New Mexico, and we formed the group there, and then we went to landed on Saipan, and then moved over to Tinian 2 days
What was the
later.
name of your group?
It was a 768th. What I ended up in the 768th Squadron, the 462nd group.
So you're based in the Pacific.
On Tinian.
On Tinian. How long were you there before you had to go on a full-fledged combat mission?
Got on Tinian like this morning, and tomorrow afternoon I was headed on my first mission to Japan.
Did you know when you landed on that island it was going to be that quick?
No. You had no, the only time you had a warning sometime was a schedule. We knew like this afternoon if we were going to fly tomorrow.
I want to ask this question. I'm a young fella, 18 years old, from Farmington, North Carolina, had made his way across the country to the southern part down in Miami. You're seeing all this new places and new areas. I'm assuming it was, is it called Tinian?
Tinian.
Tinian.
It's in the
Is it a beautiful island?
It's the Marianas Group. Well, it wasn't at that time. It was the landscape was mostly just a rocky cliff island. The trees, what trees were there, had been basically destroyed in the landing.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a very attractive place at the time.
What was your gut reaction when you were told we're going tomorrow? How did John Caudle accept that? How did you take that?
I've said many times I was kind of a scared country boy at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really know what to anticipate. Didn't have time really to talk to anybody that had already flown the missions. And actually, I flew my first 2 missions was not with my crew. I flew with a new crew that had some experience,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the way they worked. They took a new crew over and they'd split them up, to go a mission or 2
Mm-hmm.
with a new crew that had already flown.
So how that first mission? How long was that mission? The flight total?
I think that particular one was 14 hours and 40 minutes
Okay.
from takeoff to landing.
So let's kind of go through that. Let's go through the 14 hours in about 3 minutes here. You took off. Loud noise. You weren't in the back at that time.
No, you didn't have to hold your position in it until we got within a couple hundred miles of the affected area where we'd expect combat.
So when you were within 100 miles, you were told to go to your assigned position. And on that first mission, was it a full-fledged combat mission, or was it a no-go?
It was really the indoctrination put you full bore into the first one, because Yokohama was the name of the town that we hit. The mission was scheduled for 21,000 21,000 feet in elevation. As we approached the target area, I could see the puffs of smoke all around us, and I've told somebody at times it looked like you could just get out and walk on those puffs of smoke. They were so thick, and that was anti-aircraft fire.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, at that time my heart was in my throat, and don't let anybody kid you. I think anybody in that position has got to be scared. But that was one time I did talk to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not ashamed to admit it. I talked to him all the way through that thing to ask him to look after me and to look after my wife.
So you were married at that time?
Yes, I hadn't been married it was just a few months.
Did you have a photograph of her on the plane?
Oh, yes.
Did you ever get that out and look at her?
I had a little heart-shaped thing that I'd made into a necklace with her picture in it, and I had that around my neck at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a tough one. I knew we had been hit because you could, that flak, if it hit you up close enough, you could hear the thud. And I heard a wind noise that was strange at the time. I didn't know where it was or what it was until we got back to base. But anyway, we were lucky to get through that mission, as the anti-aircraft was so intense. And when we got away from the bomb run, the fighter aircraft was around us at that time too. Of course, me being
The Zeros.
Yeah, well, there was Zeros and I forgot now. Betty's, I think might have been a bomber. I've forgotten now some of the other names of the Japanese planes at that time. But me being in the tail, my line of vision was somewhat limited because I could only see from about here to here, and all I could see basically was the tracer bullets coming by. That was an indication that there was somebody coming at you from up front, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, our forward gunners would always tell you when, you know, somebody was coming in.
So could you hear the captain as well as?
Oh yeah, we were all on the intercom. I mean, we had the radio intercom system throughout, and so
When you're in, I call it a dogfight. I realize that's not a plane that would really dogfight,
No.
but when you're being shot at, is there panic on that radio system, or does it go quiet?
you know, it's amazing how, I guess you went through the training, but how calm it really was, considering the moment, because everybody was, giving what details needed to be given, nothing else. There was no excited chatter or anything that much on it, but of course everybody, yes, was excited, but it is surprising how calm it was. You see the movies where in Germany, I guess, and Japan too, or in the Pacific, where fighter planes attacking a bomber would be out there just, gunners would have 10, 15 seconds of firing time. That's not true. Being in the tail position, I only had about 2 to 3 seconds of firing time, because you consider we were traveling at about 300 miles an hour, and then the fighter, same thing coming at us, so you're basically looking at 600-mile speed, so it didn't take long for them to get out of view.
14 hours, you obviously ate on the plane.
Yes.
Tell me, I'm just curious, I mean, what would a group take to eat on a 14-hour flight?
It's an Air Force sandwich.
Oh, really?
Peanut butter and jelly.
So they didn't give you a steak meal or anything like that on these planes?
No, the one hand, kind of a joke, when you got back to the base, they go up for a briefing or follow-up. They had a shot of whiskey they gave everybody the opportunity to have.
Was that before the mission?
That was after.
Oh,
that was after. I went through that line twice.
Let me say this. If I would have been shot at, I think I'd have probably been in that line with you. How many missions did you fly?
Really, I didn't have but actually 7 combat missions, and at about 12. We flew missions on some of the other little islands that were off. I expect I had 12, 15 there, but they were not considered necessarily combat missions.
Was the first one the scariest mission?
Yeah. That one, and I guess there was one other that in the latter part of the war, the Japanese come up with this so-called Baka bomb. It was actually what it was, is a flying bomb. That pilot knew when he got in that thing he was going to die, because there was no landing gear or anything on it. It was just a flying bomb that was released from a bomber.
A kamikaze.
Yeah, yeah. And his mission was to fly into your plane.
I want to ask you about the Japanese. During the war, I know right now we're in a war with Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda, if you ask me my opinion of those people, I think they're crazy, lunatics. How was the sentiment towards the Japanese during the war, and how did you deal with them after the war?
Well, we were indoctrinated, in training to hate the Japanese. We were there to kill them. That was our mission, to kill them. And of course, in the process, we were hearing stories of how our men were being treated in some of the ones that were captured, especially in Bataan and Corregidor, the Philippines. What they were going through as prisoners of war, those that made it. It took quite a while after, and from time to time I still have a little feeling.
Animosity?
Yeah,
sure.
And it's not like it was by any means, but it's.
Now, today we all have cell phones, we have email, and we're able to text people on phones. How often were you able to talk to your wife while you were in the Pacific?
Didn't. Your only communication was a letter, which somebody else read before it was mailed. You had no means of communication back home other than a letter, and you couldn't even tell where you were. Oh, you could say you were in the South Pacific or something.
Wow. Was she able to send you letters?
Yes.
And when you would get those letters, would it cause you to sob?
Yeah, sometimes they were sad depending on what they were. Of course, I was fortunate. My wife was pretty upbeat on all of the letters we received. Package from home was something that was mighty nice to receive, because the get some cookies or something like that. Food wasn't the best. Air Force, of course, all of our facilities over there, most of it were tents. And we didn't have the best. They had the hash was the favorite food.
I'm going to come back to the South Pacific, but I want to jump forward to when the war was over. You flew back on what type of plane?
We came back on a B-29. Actually, I never did figure out exactly what would have happened after. We got called to headquarters late one afternoon, told we were coming home, being sent back to the States for special training, and we left the next morning. We were sent to, I believe it's Matherfield. Anyway, it was just it's in the Mojave Desert out in California. And we flew out of that bomb training, bombing missions on the desert there, really, of dropped sacks of flour and what have you for effect. Some special training there that we never did know exactly what, but I've surmised since then that in all probability we would have been sent back for an atomic mission probably. But the war was over. In fact, we finished our training like today, and the war was over tomorrow, so we didn't have to go back.
So when you came home, you flew from there
we
to...
brought a B-29 back. Yeah.
To where in North Carolina?
We've in California.
Okay, how did you get from California back to Farmington?
We were given, I believe it was an 11-day pass there, and I took a train, which was non-sleeper, all the way from the West Coast. Took, I've forgotten, seemed like it took about between 3 and 4 days, just solid.
So where did that train, did it end up in Salisbury?
Winston-Salem.
Okay, so the train ended up in Winston-Salem. Did your wife know that you were going to be there on that particular day?
I was able to call and tell her that we would.
So was she at the train station?
Yes.
Could you share for us what that reunion was like?
I said, I beg your pardon. I did take a commercial flight from there back to Winston-Salem. And that particular trip, I was thinking about a trip from Wendover, Utah. I took the train back. Yeah, I got a flight back into, ended up back into Winston-Salem at Smith Reynolds Airport. And my wife and her brother and his wife were there to pick me up. And it was quite a reunion.
Was their arms wide open?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Could you smell the aroma of the downtown tobacco plants? And
well, you couldn't be around Winston-Salem hardly without smelling that. That was a good smell at the time.
I guarantee it was. And we'll come back to life after the war, but let's go back to the times that you were in the South Pacific. Your missions were bombing missions, and your purpose in the plane was to protect the plane from the
tail end of it. We had fighter aircraft after us, and of course let's say in the very end of my time there was this Baka bomb. That was a kind of a scary thing to see one of those coming to you. Of course, no one never did get real close to us, but I guess one of my scariest times is over Sendai, which is north of Tokyo. We went over there. It was on a night mission, and we went over about 6,000 feet, and we were about 2/3 of the way into the mission, our part of it. And if you can imagine Winston-Salem, I don't know what the population of Winston-Salem is now, but there's 250,000 population in that town at the time, and they virtually wiped out over 50% of it at one time. Incendiary bombs. I've got a photograph here of Yokohama, what it looked like before and after the war.
Absolutely.
Were you all successful?
Hang on one second. We're going to edit this, so why don't you sit right here?
you all successful in shooting down the Baka bombers?
I never did, or my crews never did, but they were not too successful with that because number one, they didn't have fuel enough to stay in the air very long, so they had to make a quick attack. But it was scary more than anything else.
Mm-hmm. And for the tape's benefit, Don, why don't you introduce yourself, if you would?
Don Wooten, Knoxville Rotarian.
Don is going to be, you met Saturday, Don will be taking the flight with us this Saturday to Washington, D.C. with the honor flight. I'm going back to that mission. It was a nighttime mission. Were there lights on the plane down that little hallway, down that scuttle?
Everything was dark when you were on the mission. Well, I said dark. We had these camouflage lights that would not be that visible outside. But that was one time. I said it was one of the scary missions. The Japanese were very good on targeting you with searchlights.
Mm-hmm.
And we got caught in a searchlight that night, and I could have sitting in the tail of the thing. I could have read a book. It was so light in there. But we got lucky and didn't stay. I don't know whether a bomb hit it or what, but we got away from it.
And they did this from one of their fighter planes? Or
No, this was a ground.
From the ground?
Yeah. They were very good. They say we was flying that one at 6,000 feet, so they wasn't that far away.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the smoke, and it was already up there. It was a clear night, and that whole sound was just regardless of how much you hate people, you have to have a feeling that people were dying there, especially the women and children. You had to feel, for that.
I want to ask that question because, for the most part, we're in war right now, but it's so far removed. How did you deal with the fact that the mission's objective was to kill?
Well, I think one thing it helped. We were all just young kids then, 18, 20 years old. 25-year-old was considered an old man in the Air Force at that time. And I think, youngsters sometimes tend to deal with things like that a little better than adults. But we just tried not to, think about it. Mm-hmm. We had a mission to do, and that's what we were trying to do.
I was in the Army, and in basic training, when I got into bayonet training, and when you charged, your what you said was kill. And this was about the 4th or 5th week of my basic training. And once I got into that, that's when it really it chills up my spine in terms you realize exactly what you were being trained for. It had not hit me until then. And I was 21 at that time. I'd finished college. And that's a rude awakening.
Yeah.
John, I was at the Truman Library last month, and I went through there, and they had this one room, a special room, that was about the atomic bomb. And the Truman Library has the concept of allowing for people to write down their feelings about the atomic bomb. They allow for people who object to what was done on the Enola Gay. And they allow people to say that, hey, it was the right thing to do. How old are you now?
Young, 83.
83. A young 83. You went through the war. You lived through the rebuilding era of the 50s, the hippie age of the 60s, the Nixon years, the 80s with Ronald Reagan. You've seen Bill Clinton. You have seen Vietnam, Korea. You've seen the Gulf War. What is your opinion of the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Under the circumstances, the best decision has ever been made in a war. I think of the lives on American and Japanese too. If we'd have had to invade that island at that time, they were in a mindset that they were willing to die for their country, and it's just been a slaughter, really, for us to try to invade that island. And not only for us, but for them too.
Where were you when the bombs were dropped?
I was in California.
So you had flown back.
Yeah, I just finished up that month's special training that we were under. In fact, I was actually, when the war ended, I was on a bus in the way into Sacramento when the official word came that the war was over. When we got into Sacramento, that's when we knew that it actually was over, because the streets were filled with people, and it was one big party that night.
I bet it was.
If you were a GI, you were on top of the world.
One of Don and my goals for filming you, along with the other gentlemen who we're going to be flying with on Saturday, is we want there to be a living legacy of your story and your comrade's story of what took place during World War II. We're all destined to go before God someday. What would you want to tell someone who gets to watch this video 20 years from now about your experience with World War II and about your allegiance to our country?
Well, I think it makes you have a much stronger feeling for your country to be involved in those instances. It makes you appreciate your country much better. That's one thing, because until you're actually faced with somebody out there, their intent is to kill you in defense of their country as well. I feel honored, really, to had the opportunity to serve. I'm glad I had the experience, but I would not want to go through it again, even if I knew I'd come out as good as I did, because it wasn't pleasant all the time. But I think it does make you have a little more stronger appreciation for, the place we live in, the freedom that we have, and you see how some of the other people have lost that ability.
Our time is beginning to wind down, and I want to ask Don if you've got any questions you'd like to ask John as we wrap up our 30-minute interview. By the way, what was your rank?
Corporal.
Corporal John Caudle.
We had a commander that wasn't of the 768th Squadron. His favorite thing wasn't giving out rank. I guess our sergeant was the highest ranking non-com in our whole group.
That was just like a 3-sergeant, a basic sergeant.
Corporal was most of them.
Yeah.
And most of the other services, Air Force or what have you, they were all tech sergeants or what have you. But anyway, that.
And you served how long?
I was actually on active duty for 2 years, a reserve for. One thing I just like to comment on, there was one standing joke that I'm sure it was in Europe as well as in the Pacific. There was a guy a fictitious guy, or at least everybody thinks, by the name of Kilroy. He was everywhere. Every door you look behind, latrine or wherever vehicle you went in, there's the name Kilroy has been here.
I've seen that. Actually, it's in the movie Patton.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah, I had heard that too.
No, he was quite a traveler.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just impressed that you guys could handle it emotionally as well as you have. And I can understand, I think, how quiet you were about it when you got back, a lot of you. Because I was born in 1940, and I lived up a dirt road, which is a bunch of farmers. And there were 3 guys in the service that lived up that road. My dad didn't serve because back then, if you had flat feet, the Army wouldn't take you. But there were 3 guys that lived up that road that served, and luckily they came back. One of them, and they were in the Army infantry, and one of them did have an injury in combat, but he was okay. But they didn't want to talk about it for years. And I can remember it was about 45 or 46, and I just barely remember this. But I can remember neighbors, my family, talking about that these guys just didn't want to talk about what they had been through.
I'll tell you a harrowing experience for me. My first night, we was on Saipan at that night, the first night, and I was watching takeoff over on Tinian, which is just about 4 miles across the way. A plane exploded on takeoff, or crashed on takeoff, and then the ammunition and the bombs and everything went off along with it. But
That'll put the fear of God in your heart.
Put the fear of God into you when you know what you may be facing. And that, unfortunately, there was a little atoll right at the end of the runway, from there into the ocean. From the end of the runway, you had to clear that hill to get into the air.
I think one of the saddest things that I've seen and read about has been, and I'm sure this happened in World War II, well, I know it did in World War II as well as in Vietnam, was when you were fired on by your own planes because of mistaken information, intelligence, and so forth, and where you had your own target. You were targets of your own artillery or planes, and I know that happened occasionally.
We had one experience where I don't know. I guess they got tangled up or something, going the wrong direction, or coming from it wasn't exactly from the front, but a plane went over us. The night, and he just it was a so-called clear night that all of a sudden he was there. And no, I mean he was. We don't know whether he was coming at the bomb run from his wrong direction or what happened to him. We got stuff.
Well, John, we're going to end this 30-minute interview with you, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate you sharing, not only with us, but for all the people that are going to watch this video in the future or watch this DVD in the future. And I want you to know that going with you Saturday to Washington, D.C. to witness the memorial is going to be one of the highlights of my life. And I personally want to tell you how much I appreciate your service in World War II. I think you're a hero, and I'm proud to call you a friend.
Well, I don't look at being a hero. I just did what I felt like I needed to do at the time, but I sure want to say to you that I appreciate you and all the others that are making this possible. I'm really looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just appreciate the Rotarians and others that have been involved in making this possible. Yeah. And I'm like Kyle, I'm grateful to just have a chance to participate in this, because last Saturday in the pre-flight thing just gave me a taste for what this Saturday is going to be like. And just meeting with you guys last week, as Kyle and I have talked about, it was almost nonstop conversation with you three riding over to Greensboro Saturday morning. And I can't imagine what it's going to be like on the plane with a plane load of you veterans.
You know, I just stopped to think, that nobody other than you fellows there at that meeting the other morning was under 80 years old.
Well, that is our interview with John Caudle, and I want to thank you for listening in, and I want to say, to end this video, be proud to be an American.